All right, so let's talk about evolution. And what does that mean? How did that originate?
Well, evolution was an attempt to explain the beginning of life and also life as we see it, both living and extinct. And in order to talk with evolution, we really have to talk about what needs to be explained. And first of all, we have to explain the tremendous variety of life. We have to explain the fact that there are elephants and there are snails. Mm-hmm. There are eagles and there are worms. Mm-hmm. There are sequoia trees and there are rose bushes. Mm-hmm. And there are protozoa and bacteria. And all these different forms of life, tremendous variety, have to be explained. And also, we have to explain the complexity of life. The human being, for instance, has over 30 trillion cells.
That's amazing.
That is amazing. And it has over 200 different kinds of cells. Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about that, those would be cells like of our skin, cells of bones and liver and heart and intestines and on and on. And the fact that this tremendous variety and number of cells came from an original fertilized egg. And that single little egg, you would need about 13 of those put together before you'd even meet the thickness of a dime. So somehow, evolution will need to explain that progression from a single fertilized cell into this tremendous complexity and variety of life that we see. But also, even more so, life is not only of great variety and great complexity, but is tremendously coordinated and synchronized in its function. So as human beings, we know we need food in order to live and grow. Hopefully we're not growing too much anymore.
Yeah.
But you and I at least. But we need food in order to carry on our functions. Well, fortunately, we have an appetite center in our brain that makes us want to eat.
Yes.
And fortunately, we have a mouth that works, a jaw that can move, teeth that can chew, a tongue that can move the food and help swallow it. Fortunately, we have a stomach and intestines that help the digestive process. Fortunately, we have a circulatory system that can take the nutrients to the rest of the body and to the liver for processing, and on and on. So somehow, evolution needs to explain variety, complexity, and also this wonderful, synchronized, coordinated kind of function. And if that's not difficult enough, there needs to be some explanation for the beginning of the first cell out of random chemicals.
Yes.
So that's what needs to be explained here by evolution.
Yes.
Now, you asked me what evolution is. Darwin in 1859, in his book On the Origin of Species, proposed his theory. And his theory basically has three key aspects. The first one is the idea of common descent. Now, common descent simply means all life that we know or that's ever existed on Earth came from a single original parent cell. The second aspect of his theory is what he called variation, which means somehow, and he didn't explain this, but somehow there were some changes that took place that allowed then this growth and this differentiation into different life forms. Later on, scientists, as they knew more about the cell, to Darwin, really the cell was just a little sack of protein. He didn't have the understanding that we have now of the cell, and there was no way he could know that. But with the advent of molecular biology, we know that the mechanism that he called variation, scientists now call mutations, change in the genetic information. And then the third part of his theory was called natural selection. And that was natural selection was kind of like the sorting process. So that as mutations occurred, natural selection would tend to pick out the good ones. And it was really what people call survival of the fittest.
Yes.
You would pick out the most fit organisms. So basically, Darwin's theory then has to do with those three things: common descent, the variation, or what we call mutations, and natural selection. We probably need to throw in a fourth just to make it complete, because it's very important, that is time. This theory needs huge amounts of time for all these random chances, these mutations to take place to explain life as we know it today.
Well, I was thinking about the 30 trillion, is that what you said, or 300 trillion
30
cells?
trillion cells, over 30 trillion
Okay,
cells.
over 30 trillion cells. And as a doctor, obviously, you've seen damaged organs or wounds, and just thinking about the body's ability to reproduce more cells in order to repair that organ or that. I think that in itself is amazing.
It is.
That it
very
has
amazing.
the ability to do that.
Yes.
So, hearing how evolution started, and obviously we always connect the name Darwin to that. Is there any evidence that evolution could possibly be true?
You know, I think to do justice to this, Barb, we have to break this up into the three components. And we could also throw in time if we wanted to, but let's take natural selection first of all. Really, natural selection in itself is not a particularly strong concept. We know this is the flu season. We know that if a person is elderly or has emphysema or has congestive heart failure, if they develop the flu, influenza, and then that goes into pneumonia, they're much less likely to be able to survive that than a young, healthy person. So natural selection basically says, say the antelope that's maimed or whatever is more likely to fall to the predator than a healthy antelope, and whether that's antelope, human, or whatever. So natural selection, I don't think is a big controversy in that sense. As far as variation or mutation, we know that mutations occur. We know that viruses or chemicals or radiation can produce mutations. And we also know that most of those are detrimental. Almost all of them are detrimental. So we know that both mutations and natural selection occur. The big question is, can these two work together to produce new positive structures? Eyes, wings, antenna, can they produce new species? Then the other question, of course, is can really a single cell really produce all the various forms that we know of?
Okay. And so, what's the answer to that?
Well, you know, when Darwin looked around at life, and Darwin was a very bright person, a very creative thinker. He looked around and he saw between different kinds of creatures certain similarities. Mammals, for instance, they have spinal columns. They have spinal cords. And they they nurse their young, basically. One example that's oftentimes used in textbooks is the example between mammals of the forelimbs. For instance, the forelimb of a man is the arm. The forelimb of a cat is the forelegs. The forelimb of a whale is the fin. And the forelimb of a bat is a wing. And in many ways, there are certain kind of bony structures that are very similar between mammals. And Darwin saw this, and that similarity, he used the word homology for, similar structures. He saw that as evidence that there was a common ancestor from which these different species developed, but still maintaining some of these similarities. You know, and that is a possible explanation. But it's not the proof of evolution.
It's an explanation.
It's a possible
Okay,
explanation.
okay.
But just as easily, or maybe even better, similar structures could be explained by a creator, an intelligent designer who used similar kinds of plans for different kinds of organisms. I like to think of going to the Chicago Auto Show, and you go there and you see a tremendous variety of cars. And convertibles and, you know, sedans and vans and on and on. But there will be some similarities. All of them will have headlights.
Sure.
All of them will have taillights. All of them will have doors, tires, engines, steering wheels, seats in that. And you could even take that a little further. You could go outside the auto show and look at buses and trains and planes and things, and there'll be certain similarities. But no one would begin to think that these evolved by just natural means, but that they had designers who used somewhat similar plans. So I think the point is homology, as Darwin saw that, could be explained by evolution, but could also be explained by a designer, by creation. So it's not a proof for evolution. It's a possibility for evolution.
All right. Now, we just saw you standing by some of those cars. Was that you standing by some of those cars? I saw a slide go up there.
No, that wasn't me.
That was somebody else. Okay.
No, that was somebody else. Nice looking cars, though.
Yeah, I never imagined a slide with cars in there.
Yeah.
It being part of a scientific discussion, but I guess it does apply in this
those
case.
Corvettes are very, very sharp looking, aren't they?
They
Even
are.
The old ones,
They are.
Yes.
So now with DNA and us having a little bit more understanding of DNA, and I'm sure that that is going to continue to roll out, and there's going to be more and more discovery in how complex and amazing DNA is. And how does it support or does it contradict evolution? How does that fit in?
Well, that's a good question, and as we mentioned before, at the time of Darwin, he really was not familiar with DNA. That was something to be discovered much later. Darwin, in his thinking, as far as homology, he did look back to embryos, though. And to him, one of the most important evidences for evolution was the fact that embryos look very similar in the early stages. He was very much influenced by a German biologist by the name of Ernst Haeckel. And Ernst Haeckel had a reputation for being an avid evolutionist, and he would make these intricate drawings of embryos, which I think we've become very familiar with embryos now because of all the stem cell controversy, and embryos are the early forms of life that are developing, for instance, in the mammal inside the womb. For the human, we consider it the first 8 weeks or so. After that, we call it fetus. But Ernst Haeckel made a claim, and that was that the very earliest embryos were very similar between different species. And he had drawings to show that. And Darwin put a lot of stock in that because he thought, wow, if they're similar at the beginning and then they start becoming different as they develop, that really it's kind of a picture of evolution. And Haeckel had an interesting statement, which is a mouthful, and he said, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
It's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful.
Okay, so say it again. Go ahead.
Yes. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And to put that in simple terms, ontogeny is ontogeny is the development of the embryo.
Okay.
So the development of the embryo recapitulates, which means kind of restates in a concise form, phylogeny, which is that evolutionary process.